Hello, everyone. So I also invite you to come into this space, to close your eyes, to make yourself comfortable, and to take another deep breath. Imagine that today is September 15th, 2032. It is still International Democracy Day, but as you're walking home from work, you reflect on how much has changed in everyone's political lives. You've been thinking about it all day, in fact, because this morning you found a letter in your mailbox, an invitation to be considered for your country's new executive assembly. Just like the other people who received this invitation at random, if you choose to accept it, it means putting your name in the hat for a second lottery to ensure that members of this top decision-making body will broadly and equally represent society's diversity. Yes, last year your partner was invited to serve on the Education Policy Assembly. What surprised them most was that after all the deep felt discussions, the Assembly was able to achieve consensus on so many difficult issues, from exams to school lunches. Your best friend was on the most recent Judiciary Selection Commission, set up to take the partisanship out of the appointment of judges. And a few years back, your 16-year-old daughter was a member of the Legislative Assembly. Several other people you know have accepted to serve on more local panels on zoning and transport. So being in the Executive Assembly will take a big chunk of your time, but it could be your turn to have a real say and hold real decision-making power. This new approach to running our daily lives has become really noticeable since a national policy of democracy for all came into force 3 years ago. It means that, like jury duty, anybody selected by lot is entitled to paid time off work to take up their civic duties. Childcare, transport, and other costs are all covered. You receive a good state salary for your time, the same way elected officials were once paid. Members of all of these deliberative assemblies are all selected by sortition, meaning by lottery. Sortition used to be a word that most people hadn't even heard before, but now everybody knows it. It's become the new ritual of democracy, the same way elections once were. Rather than going to the ballot box once every few years, there are regular lotteries for different assemblies all the time. Now, that doesn't mean we're all involved in everything always. What has changed, though, is that instead of parties and professional politicians, ordinary citizens, people like me and you, your mom, your dad, brothers and sisters, friends and colleagues, we are the ones in charge, taking turns representing others and being represented. What is our task in these assemblies? To weigh evidence, to listen to one another, and to find common ground on our policy and legislative proposals. For any given decision, experts and stakeholders of all kinds brief the Assembly members. In fact, the members can call witnesses from among them during any time during the process, but it's the citizens who actually decide. The democratic wave hasn't just been limited to voting and politics. It runs throughout society and your life. You see the changes in your workplace, your children's schools, and even your community and friends circle. New legislation introduced last year means that your boss changed the way that your company is run to introduce a board with members selected by lot amongst employees. You fulfilled your duty last year and have seen how this change in governance structure has already transformed the company culture. Your son's school board is now governed by a rotating, randomly selected group of teachers from schools across the region. And last year, your son was selected by lot to serve on their student council. You saw how, even though he was a little nervous at first, the experience gave them a lot more confidence in their abilities to lead, to work with others, and to voice their views. Over this decade, your social circle has expanded in new ways. Through you and your family's various roles in these different assemblies, you've met people who are doctors, bakers, teachers, CEOs, cleaners, students, writers, chefs, people of all ages coming from all walks of life. You've stayed in touch with many of them, and 2 of your best friends are former fellow Assembly members. You arrive home at your door. Yes, you think, I'm definitely going to volunteer for the Executive Assembly. Things are so much better this way. Take a deep breath and open your eyes. This dream of a new system of democracy can come true. Even if achieving it in a decade may seem ambitious, we can shift political and legislative power to everyday people. And we can design and build new institutions that recognize people's agency and dignity, that channel our collective wisdom, and that enable us to find common ground. Today, we're celebrating the launch of DemocracyNext, an international policy and action institute with exactly that goal. We're not starting from scratch with these ideas. We're building on a growing wave of over 600 examples of citizens' assemblies around the world, where everyday people selected by lottery have proven time and time again that we are able to come together across diversity, to grapple with complexity, to listen to one another, and to decide together. In the past few decades, everyday people have been finding original and thoughtful solutions to problems that politicians have been stuck on. Climate change in the UK, France, and elsewhere, constitutional changes in Mongolia, tech platform regulation in Canada, and in Ireland, overcoming the divisions on abortion and same-sex marriage. Permanent citizens' assemblies already exist and have been tested in Paris, Bogota, Toronto, Osbelgen, and elsewhere. At a time when so many people feel disillusioned with politics, feel powerless to influence change, and are frustrated with the state of our countries and the world, these examples give me hope and inspiration that we could be building a genuinely democratic system, founded on the principles of citizen participation, representation by lot, and deliberation. I think it's more important than ever that we don't give into fatalism and that we channel our energy into enabling change. We're not limited to trying to save our broken electoral politics or falling into autocracy. Another democratic future is possible. So thank you for joining us as we embark on this mission, because it will only succeed with all of you. And it's why we've invited you to join us in imagining another democratic future with us today. We don't have all the answers yet about how this would work and look like, but that's exactly why we need all of you. Another democratic future is possible. Democracy Next is all of us working to make it a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you for sharing that vision. I felt kind of like an opening right here in my chest as you were walking us through this future 10 years from now, an opening and a tingling. And it's wonderful to see friends and colleagues in the chat, Ramin, Beth, Doreen, folks from sort of different walks of this journey that we have been on together. So welcome. And as we arrive, we invite you to put into the chat, what was it like for you to be hearing this vision? How did that land in your bodies? And it's exciting to see the responses in thus far. As someone who has been obsessed with how to improve the power of ordinary people in the structures that govern their lives, first as a journalist, then as an organizer and an implementer of initiatives in over 30 countries with a focus on the majority world, I will admit that when I first got Claudia's invitation to do this event for the International Day of Democracy, I was a wee bit skeptical. My first thought was, wait, there is an International Day of Democracy? And then my second thought was, okay, so we're gonna get together and talk about the various dumpster fires facing our democracies around the world. All right, cool, sounds fun. I will bring the popcorn. But I quickly realized that my own cynicism and skepticism was born of 15 years either doing incrementalist work that tinkered on the edges of our democracies, and we all know where that has gotten us, or working on gorgeous initiatives that really embodied care and joy and democracy, but in small is beautiful ways. And we were unsure about how they might scale and go really head to head with the fascist, well-funded, globally networked forces that are threatening our democracies. And so it is a true pleasure to be with all of you today, over 300 of you logging back on and counting, to inject some much needed hope and fresh thinking into our shared project of democracies that are truly by and for the people. Today, in the time that we have, we will talk about what concretely that means, where we are in the state of play today, and then also be clear-eyed about the challenges on the road ahead if DemNext vision and the world that Claudia just invited us in, the world that Claudia just invited us into is actually to become reality. So again, my name is Panthea Lee, and I have the honor of hosting this conversation today. I'm the founder and executive director of Reboot, and I'm a practitioner fellow at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. But most importantly, I am a champion of true democracy and a cheerleader for this team that is working to make it real. And I know this is true of all the brilliant humans that you're about to meet, who are all advisors to DemNext. So I will introduce them quickly in turn and start with Brenda Ogembo. Brenda is a principal clerk assistant in the Legislative and Procedural Services Division of the Parliament of Kenya. And she's currently working with the Kenyan Senate, where she's pushing for innovation on public involvement in governance. And Brenda, to kick off, love you to introduce yourself, and then also just with a response to how did that opening vision land in your body?
Thank you, Cynthia, and it's really exciting to be here today. So yes, as you said, I work in Parliament and I do many things in Parliament, but one of the main things that I do is I try to push democratic innovations and new ways of engaging in Parliament, because we have public participation as part of our legislation. It's required, but we have faced a lot of whether frustration or pullback, or people don't want to engage. And so one of my roles is to find out why that is and to try and find ways for people to engage with our committees in the legislative business. Hearing Claudia talking, it's challenging to me because it does sound exciting, but then I'm also grappling with feelings of this is not possible. Thinking about the context in which I exist, the context in which I work. And obviously the immediate things that come to me are challenges. That's the first thing that pops up to me. And I'm like, well, but we still need to try this, because I work with a lot of young people and a lot of them want more meaningful engagement. They want to feel like they have a direct stake in the politics and their decision making. And I know that this is something that would be of interest to them. And so we have to engage in the future. And they have chosen not to engage in the way that we have traditionally done so. And so it's this context of a pull between, I think it's impossible, but I know that we have a generation that is ready for this. And so that is the exciting thing, when you're where you may not have the tools or the answers, but you know that there's a generation coming that can absorb this and is ready for it. So yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. Let's fight for the impossible. Next up, we have Art O'Leary, who is Secretary General to the President of Ireland and a former Secretary to the Constitutional Convention. Art, you're someone who's been in this fight for a while, and we'll hear a little bit more of that to come. But as someone who's been around the block, what was it like for you to hear this?
Well, thank you, Panthea. Hello, everyone. As a civil servant in this group, perhaps with the exception of Brenda, I'm unusual in that my main job, and the reason I'm paid a lot of money, is to worry about things, and when I first heard Claudia's vision for what 10 years hence might look like, frankly, it terrified me, and because the leap between where we are now and where Claudia sees us is so vast that you wonder internally. And this is someone who believes in Citizens' Assembly. I have been involved in Citizens' Assemblies in this country, in Ireland, for the last decade. But the other thing they pay me a lot of money for is to get hard jobs done. So once I had accepted the premise of Claudia's vision, then we try to work backwards in relation to, well, how we might achieve this. And frankly, I feel very excited at the idea that the idea of deliberative democracy is evolving so quickly, because it would be very easy to continue jogging on the spot and to say, well, listen, we have a model that works and that seems to work around the world, 600 examples and all of that. But people, including people in DemocracyNext and in this room and in rooms all over the world, people are sitting down and say, how can we push these boundaries? How can we leap to the next generation of thinking in giving the citizens a voice? So I'm delighted to be involved in this project, dying to hear what everybody has to say, and looking forward to watching the progress of DemocracyNext in the years ahead.
Thank you, Art. Scared, but we got to push forward. I think I'm hearing a theme here. Next, we have Ellen Landemore, who is a professor of political science at Yale, the author of Open Democracy and other seminal books in this space, and who has observed the French Citizens Convention on climate. Now, Ellen, as someone who has written some of the foundational texts and theories our space is organizing around, how do you respond to the vision that was just put forward?
Well, it feels good. It feels right. It feels exciting. It feels like the opposite of this permanent state of cognitive dissonance we experience between our aspirations as citizens of so-called democracies and the actual lack of power and alienation from politics most of us experience in reality. So to me, this is my main point. This is what democracy should be like if it measured up to its meaning, people's power. It's what democracy should feel like, be like, if it measured up to a vision of democracy as a way of life, as opposed to a mere set of narrowly defined political institutions. So I'm on board. I'm a theorist. For me, I'm not afraid of the sort of a utopian aspect, even as I've observed, empirical examples and concrete realities. So it's a difficult path, but look, we're here despite the technology, despite the distance, despite our different upbringings and values, and I think I'm hopeful we can make this a reality at some point.
Thank you. And then last but not least, David van Reybrouck, who is a cultural historian, archaeologist, and the author of Against Elections, The Case for Democracy. David's a writer, poet, playwright, and the author of literary histories of Congo and Indonesia, and he's currently writing a book on the climate crisis and democracy. So David, your background's interesting. In addition to being an activist, you're also a playwright, and these are all world-making and world-building roles. And so I guess, finally, how would you respond to the world being offered at the start?
Oh, I'm totally thrilled by the vision that was just presented by Claudia. And I feel so for two reasons. DemNext is like the first global initiative for bringing this innovative form of democracy. And normally I don't like chats next to a webinar, but I really enjoy seeing where people all hail from during this one. This is absolutely exciting. I mean, we have a number of national organizations pushing for democratic innovation. We have a European one, but this is like a worldwide movement now. So this is really exciting. That for me is my first reason for enthusiasm. The second one is that Claudia's vision is the one that tries to see democracy beyond elections. And I think it's right to have this utopian ideal. For a long time, we've been trying, and I think for the next couple of years or even decades, we'll have to marry classical electoral democracies with sortition-based democracies. But I think it's really useful to have this long-term horizon of what democracy could look like in the future. So this is really great.
Thank you. Thank you. And then once again, we have Claudia Schwalitz, who is the CEO and the co-founder of DemocracyNext, and she previously led the OECD's work on the future of democracy. And I know many of you are familiar with this work. And she co-wrote with her brilliant co-founder, Yeva Chesnula-Tite, the seminal Deliberative Way report. Claudia has been involved in the design of 3 permanent citizens' assemblies in Europe, including Ostbelgien in Paris, and she's the author of The Populist Signal and the People's Verdict. So Claudia, as we're launching into discussion, would just be really curious on your journey in coming to this. I understand that you came to this work through your research on populism, working with political parties and campaigns, but I also know a lot of folks in that world and the almost like singular focus on electoral politics that there can be. So what made you break from that frame and come to co-found DemNext?
Thanks, Panthea. No, indeed, like you say, I guess like the starting point for me of all the work I was doing on deliberative democracy was the research that I was doing on populism and trying to understand the extent to which people's disillusionment with politics, with the system, feeling like they didn't have a voice, being able to actually shape decisions affecting their lives was driving people towards populist parties. And I mean, it's obviously not the only thing, it's a complex phenomenon, but I'm deeply convinced that it's one part of it and that that's a very legitimate set of feelings that people have. And if that's the case, then it's never going to be top-down kind of policies that are different on the economy or anything else that really actually gets to the heart of people's feelings of not being able to shape decisions that are affecting them. So I don't know, the kind of shorter version of the story is then I started doing work on democratic innovation a bit more broadly. And when I first came across the examples of deliberative democracy, and actually one of the first times I came across that was through David van Reybrouck's book, Against Elections, where there was just something that that clicked in the sense of like actually this notion of randomly selecting groups of people to be broadly representative of society is actually much closer to a true meaning of democracy than what we have today with elections. And over time now I was working at the OECD for a number of years, looking into these 600 or so examples of these processes around the world. And there's just so much evidence that we have that this really works as a way of both getting better decisions, but it's also a more democratic way of doing things. And that this approach of adding on citizens' assemblies to a system that has a whole other different set of incentives at its heart with elections, the short-termism, the campaigns and political financing and lobbying. And I had also worked actually for a few years before the OECD at a consultancy where we worked with political parties and campaigns. I did polling, I did focus groups, and I've seen that side of politics as well. But adding on citizens' assemblies to this system, which I think is fundamentally broken, is not actually fixing in itself what isn't working, in my view. It's not shifting where power lies. It's not fundamentally changing actually who's taking decisions and how those decisions are being taken. And this has really been the main motivation of wanting to start Democracy Next, to say that actually, we could have another democratic future. We could be building another new set of democratic institutions based on these principles of deliberation, of sortition, meaning representation by lottery, participation, and that this is possible because we have all these contemporary examples along with this bigger historical set of examples as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, you also see another few faces on the screen, and you'll be hearing from them a little bit later on, but just wanted to welcome and have everyone wave to the rest of the DemNext team. We have Yeva, Fiona, John, and Mark, so you can see them all, and you'll be hearing them from a little bit more at the end as well. Now that you've heard from our esteemed panelists, we are now going to move into a little bit of a discussion around where the deliberative democracy field is today, what we have seen in terms of its influence on our current state of play in our democracies and societies. And I really appreciate, I think it was Ashok who sort of named some of the hollowness and the tension that he's feeling in his body around sort of this vision that we're putting forward and the current, state of different democracies under threat, basically. And so, we want to be grappling with these, and also, what it's actually going to take, what challenges are in our way if we actually need to make this vision real. So we'd love to keep hearing audience reactions and questions. I will do my best to try and bring them in, but the chat is going very quickly. And so if there are questions that you also want to make sure get addressed at the end, given that we had to start 20 plus minutes late, we'll do our best to make ample time for that if folks can stay, but please then use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen so that we can make sure that puts into a separate space for the end. And yeah, so we'd love your questions and reactions throughout. Now, so actually, I actually wanted to start just with a synthesis of what I heard from each of you. I think that through the chat, in the conversations, there is a lot of nervousness. I'm scared. The pull of cynicism, this is impossible, seems to be very strong. And at the same time, we want to muster our courage. We want to open our imagination. We want to believe that there is a larger frame and a way of working that we think is possible. But now I'm curious that if we shift to the state of play today, what then are the feels? What then comes up in our bodies? And Art, I would love to start with you because you've been involved in this. You've been involved in a decade of citizens' assemblies in Ireland, and which has seen some extraordinary changes from the very first one 10 years ago. And since you've been the general secretary for 2 citizens' assemblies that are ongoing now, one on biodiversity and one on Dublin's mayoral system. So how do you see the current state of play in terms of where the field is? Would love to hear a bit about how you started on this journey and how you've seen it evolve.
Okay, I mean, this can be a very long story, but I'll make it very short and be rude and stop me abruptly when I go over time. I got a call late 10 years ago. I got a call late one Monday night from our Prime Minister saying, "We have a thing that's in our program for government. It's never going to work, but we think that you're the guy to do it." And well, tell me what it's called and what it's about. And he said, it's called the Constitutional Convention. And we're going to put 100 people in a room and we're going to give them a whole pile of things to look at. And we want them to make recommendations to government. But as I said, it's never going to work, but we have to do it. And would you mind giving it a try? And so we had a conversation at the end of which I said, well, let me get you right. Let me be clear, Prime Minister. I can do whatever I like with this group of people as long as I don't spend any money and I don't kill anybody. And that was the starting point for the Citizens' Assembly journey in Ireland. And 10 years on, I can honestly say that Citizens' Assemblies have transformed the way Irish society is today. You know, if nothing else, it has got buy-in from the political system, because the two big social issues of our age, abortion and marriage equality, which was extraordinarily difficult to have a conversation about in Ireland. The Citizens' Assembly provided recommendations which the government put to the people, and the people agreed. So what it has done is provide a safe, respectful, equal environment in which to have a conversation about things that governments, the political system, or society find difficult to talk about. And interestingly, our two newest Citizens' Assemblies, which are currently underway at the moment, we asked the citizens, each of the new members who've been invited to take part, why it is that they wanted to be a part. And some said, well, I'm interested in the issue. And some said, I'd like to be involved in public service. But a third of them said, we know in our hearts and our souls that citizen assemblies are a way of getting hard jobs done, you know, which was an extraordinary achievement in 10 years. And I've spoken many, many times about Irish Church to audiences all over the world about this. And people assume that there is something culturally different about Ireland that makes it such a success. But I don't believe that's the case, you know, and I believe if you design programs, if you give people a voice, and if you recruit properly to ensure that your Citizens' Assembly is representative of the people. So everyone in Ireland, when they look into this room full of 100 people, should be able to see themselves in that room, or somebody who has the same opinion as them. And we now trust the system. And we have the spectacle right now of the political system fighting amongst themselves to have the next issue to be discussed by a Citizens' Assembly. There are four assemblies in the current programme for government. We're running 2 right now. And there is a big fight over which one is next up and running in January. So this, to my mind, is a good thing. So, and we do it in a very, very straightforward and a very, very transparent way. And I think that adds to the success of that journey as well.
Right. Thank you, Art. So you went from the random kid at school that no one wanted to sit at the lunch table of to the cool kid where everyone's now fighting for the next Citizens' Assembly. So that's quite a journey in 10 years. Well done. Well done.
Yeah, well, very kind of you to say, but I'm still the person that nobody wants to have lunch with, because I am a citizen. I am a Citizens' Assembly bore, to be absolutely honest. But thank you for thinking of me otherwise.
Now, Art, you said something there in that, you know, these spaces are safe and respectful. And I know, you know, all the work that your team and, you know, folks do to sort of make these safe, respectful spaces. But we also know that, you know, respect and safety in society and also in the world is not evenly distributed. And so I'm curious then, just around hearing around to talk about some of the sort of challenges in this, you know, uneven starting place that we're at. And I'd love to actually put this question to Brenda, who wrote your PhD on deliberative democracy at the University of Birmingham. And now you're working on ways to sort of make this vision real in the Kenyan Senate. Now, folks may not know this, but in Kenya's constitution, public participation is mandatory on every bill in government. And you're finding innovative ways then to get ordinary people more involved in legislation beyond the usual suspect who hold respect, who are safe and protected. So what's this journey been like? And how do you see this conversation both within Kenya and also on the broader global landscape?
Thank you, Panthea. And I was just listening to art and thinking, oh my goodness, that sounds like this dream place where people engage and there's all this money to do citizens' assembly. Because that's the first thing that came to me, when you hear citizens' assemblies and even listening to kind of the vision that Claudia is setting up about paying people living wage to come and do citizens' assemblies and giving childcare. And you're in a situation in this country where public participation has become a way for people to earn an income. Where you have governors and your politicians paying people to come and take part in public participation in order to be able to advance the agenda that they have, because people don't have incomes. There's a lot of unemployment. You have a lot of very poor people who don't volunteer, and this is actually a very complex issue, because it's not just about the levels of poverty. A lot of this also comes from if you will, post-colonial experiences and people's idea and understanding of what the state is and what their role is within the state. And for them, the state is a place of extraction. And I talk about this in my PhD, where you go to the state to get something. This idea of the common good doesn't exist, and it exists more within the aspect of your community or your tribe, if you will. And so even when you're talking about starting from a place of what is a commonality, where is the starting point of this, you have to think about the context and the culture that exists in that society. And so one, there's just the fact that deliberation in the way that it is now and in the way that it's progressing is increasingly leaving behind the global south. It's becoming an increasingly very expensive exercise. When you think about paying people or compensating people for their time, we can barely make public participation on every bill or just everyday public participation work, either because of paying people or because you need to facilitate it and you need to do it consistently and do it all the time. It becomes extremely expensive. And so you have government officials shying away from this and saying, this is not doable, this is not feasible. And so they go back to safe actors because they know that they're going to get a position, and they challenge them. Why don't you go bring the views that those people have and bring it to us? But concurrently, you also have the other side of that debate where there's this fear that if you open up this discourse to everybody, communities or tribes are going to lose their negotiating power, because people negotiate their position within the tribe and then they come and bring it to the stage to ensure that they take something for themselves. So this space where you cannot control who these actors are, you cannot control what the outcomes are. It's okay on broad bills, but if you have it as a formal decision-making mechanism, then you're coming up against another institution that is going to fight you. And that is context and culture. And that's why I say it's important to test some of these ideas in different contexts where people have different kind of institutional identities that anchor them within society. And the other thing that comes to me is ideas of literacy. I mean, I think obviously, I know there's research out there. John Fishkin has done research on Uganda and the fact that people who are illiterate can still engage in deliberation. But I work in parliament. I do this work every single day. And I know for a fact that we have people who come to deliberation and really do not understand the context in which they're engaging. So they will come and they will be asking for different things. They will not be engaging on the discourse on the table. For them, it's an opportunity to come and see their politician or see whoever it is that's there and ask for everyday goods. I'm talking about water, I'm talking about sanitation, I'm talking about, food, bursaries for education. That is what they've come to do there. They're not interested in engaging in the high policy decisions that politicians are discussing. And so when you ask them, that is not what the discourse is about, they will tell you, but that is what my problem is. And that is what I need addressed. Right. And so having this deliberation activities and inviting people, and yet you're not addressing, kind of their basic needs or the challenges that they have every day, might be frustrating. I'm not saying that that's what it is. I'm saying that we have to put ourselves in a place where we haven't tested this in every context. We talk a lot about citizens' assemblies being universal, like we have 600. How many of them have actually been tested in this context where people cannot either read, cannot write, some of the ideas are, and I say this a lot of respect, perhaps beyond their comprehension, because they have everyday things that they need to engage with. And the place where they get that is within their community. And so they go back to that safe space because they know that that is what is going to be advocated for them if they come together as a community. And so I think when I hear that, I know that there is a demographic across the continent who are ready for the kind of discourse that Art is talking about. But government in this context must respond to everybody. And the greater majority are not those. They're not the kind, it's almost the kind of demographic that you're going to, maybe move to Europe or, educate it. And government for them is an alternative. they form alternative spaces of engagement to get the things that they want. And everyday citizens, the common person, the poor person, is this beyond their comprehension? Do we then need to test it in a different way? And this is just questions. I don't think it wouldn't work. It's just ideas that we need to reflect on. How do you contextualize? And that's why my PhD is a lot about understanding context. We really have to appreciate the context in which we're operating.
Absolutely, yeah. Brenda, thank you so much for bringing up these points, and I think we'll be coming back to them in a little bit as well. I think it's important to think about what are the suite of approaches, at our disposal when we're talking about, really involving everybody in this. Can deliberative democracy mechanisms stretch and evolve and expand to be able to, address these concerns you're making, or are we, saying this is what it's suited for, and against a suite of others? So I really appreciate you bringing that in. David, wanted to come to you actually. It's, I think, unusual and such an honor to have a poet and playwright in these spaces, and yet you were also one of the key initiators, I think some folks might know this, of the original G1000 in Belgium in 2011. It was an initiative driven by civil society in the void of Belgium not having a government for over 500 days. And then since then, you've been involved in the design of 3 permanent citizens' assemblies in Europe, Ostbelgien, Paris, and a European capitals to be announced permanent citizens' assembly on climate governance. So curious, why you have chosen to organize in this space. And I think, Brenda's comments on context are important, but I guess, in these 3 European contexts that you've seen, also, what do you see in terms of different folks' ability to come in and deliberate and have conversations on things that are thorny across all the things that divide us?
Thank you, Panthea. To be honest, the thing I like best is just to sit down on my own and to write some poetry. But I find it very hard to do so when the roof is leaking. And in terms of democracy, the roof is leaking. And I see it as part of my responsibility to get up and do what I can about it. I think we're at a crossroads, really. It might very well be true that the vision, the horizon, so beautifully sketched by Claudia at the beginning of this session might become a reality one day. But it might also be the case that we are going to lose democracy. We've seen return of authoritarianism in quite a number of established democracies. And if you look at the annual indexes, whichever one you consult for the past 15 years, we've seen basically a loss of democratic tenure across the globe. So these are worrying times. And that's why, as a writer, I spent a considerable amount of my time to the challenges that are in front of us. And the reason I continue to do so is because they make me hopeful. What I've seen over the past couple of years is really, it's first of all what the OECD has described as the deliberative wave. Indeed, over the past couple of years, we've seen an incredible uptake or a genuine surge of citizen assemblies. So people, governments start to do it once. A second step is you see decision makers doing it often. And now we're moving to the third step where we are doing it all the time. And I've been a privileged witness of that transition. We're not only transitioning towards a carbon neutral society, we're also transitioning towards a more democratic society. And I think these two really run in parallel. And so I remember a couple of years ago, it was not late at night, like in the case of Arthur Leary in Ireland. It was just on a Tuesday morning. The minister president of the German-speaking part of Belgium, which is the smallest federal entity on earth, asked me, your idea to combine elections and lottery, has this been done? I said, well, it exists on paper, but it's never been done in practice. And I added, you could write history. And he said, yeah, let's try and do this. We are so small, but we have powers comparable to Scotland or Catalonia. So let us become the laboratory for democratic innovation in Europe. And let us become perhaps the first place where a permanent citizens' assembly drafted by lot is on the same level as the parliament. I thought this was quite brave, and even added, we're going to make a lot of mistakes, but well, may the others learn from our mistakes. We're the laboratory setting, so let's do this. So it was truly exciting to sit with a number of experts, including Claudia, to sit through this experience of designing the world's first permanent citizens' assembly. And when it was voted unanimously, it was a great moment. And then we got the reaction, well, yeah, it's so small, it's only 80,000 people. No wonder it's gonna work there. People all know each other. And then just one summer ago, we were invited by the mayor of Paris to come and redesign the Ost-Belgian model to the capital of the fifth economy in the world. So a bunch of international experts came together to the Parisian town hall to sit together and design and scale up what had been done before. And FIDE, the Federation of Innovation and Democracy Europe, played a really valuable role there. This has been started and kicked off. It's been voted, it's been accepted, and it's been started a couple of months ago. So this is a great step. And now there's a major European city who's been watching these developments and saying, this is interesting, especially combined with the other transition, the climate transition. You know, climate policies are affecting every one of us. So it seems not more than normal that every one of us could have their say in this development of new climate policies. So with a group of people, we have been designing the first permanent climate assembly that will be running on for the next decades, at least until 2050. So these are, I think, exciting developments. And the thing, if I say I feel hopeful, and I'm going to end there, you know, I've organized a few citizens' assemblies. I've helped to design them. I've visited quite a number of them. It's the sound they make, Panthea. It's just, if you hear the silent screaming on social media, if you see that voters have to keep their mouth shut at the moment they enter the voting booth, what a difference with the sound the citizens' assembly make. There is this buzz of people who do not know each other, but who try to talk to each other to help to shape their future. I think that's something really moving and something very important and something we have probably forgotten in the history of Western democracy.
Thank you for that invitation to come back to our senses. And I also think that the sound of silent screaming on social media might be your next poem. So just an offer there. I think there's lots to unpack. Thank you for that. Hélène, so would love to hear a little bit from you. You know, it feels like it's amazing that we had 800 people, you know, sign up for this. It feels like a lot of the cultural organizing, you know, the case that we're making, it's like reaching more and more people, you know, we're hitting the more mainstream. And you've been really central to this work. You've written central political theories for democracy beyond elections, and these theories are gaining traction in policy circles. And yet, I think there are, you know, questions. I see some in the Q&A, and actually invite panelists to look at the Q&A and answer there if you can. I'll try and bring some in, but would be, you know, I think some folks, Graham Johnston is asking, you know, there's some like practical questions, like, do we see this transition from current parliamentary systems? And, you know, like, how, would citizens' assemblies be replacing perhaps upper houses? Keeping, like, you know, so just some of the practicalities, but then also just at large, there are questions around, are these relevant to everybody? I think Ashok has a few questions in here around, you know, are we really just talking about Western, you know, quote unquote, developed nations? Or are there other considerations that we need to keep in mind in terms of, you know, culturally, as we're trying to build this larger global movement? Are there other considerations that we need to keep in mind, given different political systems and structures, given different cultures? So I know that's a really big question, but I'm just looking at the different questions and wondering, given your, you know, finger on the pulse of all this, how you might respond.
Yes, thank you. So I think I'm going to start from where Brenda left us with this somewhat, you know, I mean, justified doubts about the translatability of these models, mostly developed in the wealthy, you know, white Christian European Western context, you might say, to the larger world. And I think it's important to remember that at least the vision for DemNext is not just sortition, it's also participation. So, and deliberation, right? So we focus on sortition because it's the most clearly different aspect of DemNext compared to the electoral system, but really participation rights are central as well. And that can lead to forms of involvement that do not go through lotteries. So, you know, social movements, participatory budgeting, crowdsourced processes, there will be other forms of presence for people, and they usually correspond to very traditional forms of presence of people in politics in many countries around the world. So it's not like the only model is ancient Greece or these new forms of citizens' assemblies. On the contrary, I think we need to tap locally in the traditions and past and histories of countries of the world. And we know now that, you know, democracies preceded ancient Greece. So there are all kinds of models of forms of deliberations at the village level that were very inclusive, even if it was not, you know, on the basis of sortition and you know, with the definition of the demos that sometimes was a bit exclusionary. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the point about, well, this is a costly sort of democracy you're talking about. Well, first of all, the fact that there's no money for this sort of thing is a product of the current system. So we managed in France to get the government to spend something like 12 million euros on the Great National Debate and 6 million euros on the Citizens Convention for Climate. And so I'm sure, like, you know, to some poorer countries, it seems a lot. But we should be ready to invest in our democratic infrastructures. They're the pillars of our society. So I think we need to change the mentality. And then certainly, again, you know, countries where there's, you know, worries about access to water and very basic rights, you might say, well, it's a luxury. But I don't see that as a luxury. I think that the poverty, the lack of access to water, these are all also political results of a dysfunctional system. So once you invest in your political system, well, maybe people will have more resources and more education and more time to invest, and it will start a virtuous cycle that will reinforce democratic institutions and also educate people, give them the sort of rights and access they currently lack. So I wouldn't necessarily see the lack of education or the lack of access to basic needs an obstacle. You know, to these new forms of democratic participation. I think the democratic participation will lead to better outcomes. I hope that somewhat addresses some of the worries.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, I want to just pick up on a point that you just said there, and maybe this is a question for everybody. I want to maybe pose two more questions to the group, and then we'll actually go to Q&A. I think we'll try and go to 45 past the hour, depending on where you are. So just a little bit over, given the late start. Now, you know, Ellen, you talked about, you know, you mentioned sort of different types of processes, crowdsourced processes, participatory budgeting, you know, things like that. And I think different folks have questions. I'm sort of scanning the chat around just how different do we think that the outcomes of deliberative mechanisms can be versus other participatory mechanisms that we have seen that have come before, particularly when it comes to questions of some observed dilution, you know, limited, selected adoption of final recommendations. And, you know, given where we are in the process, I'd be curious what, you know, any of the panelists might say about this.
So is this a question for me, or is it for everyone? Or
for everyone, but you're also free to answer. Yeah.
Oh, I'll just mention one thing. I think for me, the reason why participatory budgeting and crowdsourced processes and these other things based on self-selection are a bit problematic is that, I mean, I think they have a role to play, but, you know, maybe not as central as sortition. It's because, of course, there's a huge selection bias, much greater than in you know, citizens' assemblies, even without the mandatory participation, because they bring in the people with time on their hand, people that don't end up being representative statistically or descriptively of the larger public. So you introduce new biases. They may not be electoral biases, but they're self-selected biases. And that's problematic if your goal is to track the preferences and values of the larger country. And the other thing is that because they're often cast under the imaginative, they're associated in our imagination with participation, they become these auxiliary ways of involving the people, and it's a supplement to the existing system. If you use a vocabulary of representation, you change understanding. All of a sudden, it's in competition with elected officials, not as like helpers, you know, and they become much harder to ignore. Because they have a legitimacy of their own, not based on election, but based on sortition and kind of diversity they bring to the table. So that's why in my work, I've really emphasized that we need to conceptualize the participants in these democratic innovations as representatives of a new kind, of a democratic kind, whereas the elected officials are representatives of an aristocratic or oligarchic kind. And I know it runs against our intuitions and the education we've received and the acculturation to democracy we've received. But the fact is that that's much closer to the truth, I think, than the belief that the most we can get from democracy are these electoral sort of concepts.
Yeah, appreciate that. I mean, I think just I think sometimes folks have questions about this space and like, well, what about just going to the counterintuitive, like, what about the relevance for these conversations for communities that see themselves as fighting for justice from outside institutions of power, right? That, believe in sort of putting pressure from the outside. I think Oliver Haltaway asks, in this vision, what is the role of activism and people collectively promoting and organizing around big and radical ideas? And Ellen, I think what you're saying is, it might seem counterintuitive because it's, we're sort of, we're randomly selecting people, but that is actually a more democratic form of it, so it's like the representation and the equity is by design as part of the system here, right? I'd be curious if others have reflections on these points.
I was just thinking about that actually, and thank you, Helen. I mean, I think you've made some very important points, and it's something that I continue to struggle with about cost and what should be spent and things like that, and whether government should commit to it. But there's a very interesting point that I always think about when it comes to institution, and it's the idea that when people come into institution and they come as themselves rather than a collective or representing a collective, if you will, that they will then make a decision that is removed from kind of the collective again, that is electoral politics. And I think about I'm always going to refer to my context because that is the one that I know, where you have, like I said, people carrying with them ethnic identities. And so when they're making decisions, whether it's about selection of judges, which I think is one of the examples that Claudia gave, is that there's the inherent ethnic bias, that this is not, what is, you're going to say, okay, fine, the legislature is driven by, some of those considerations, but when the person is sitting making that decision, there's still the reality of their community and what is their representative going to vote for, where you have, joint chambers and, getting to them and feeling the burden to represent your community when you're making a decision. You're not just making it for the sake of the common good. The first layer is, the identity that belongs to your community and the fact that you must exist in that community. And I think one of the things that that had been asked, and we've talked about even with Claudia, is I think in certain contexts, we need to think about the groundwork that we need to do. And I think that is some of the things that Helen is saying, participation and how you build that, and thinking that how do you get people to finance that themselves? I think those of you who work in this space know that a lot of participation, even just basic participation, is funded by development partners. And so there is a lot of lack of ownership, and as you rightly put it. But how do you get that kind of ownership? How do you get this to be something that people want to do? There's an expectation and people are willing to demand the government spends money on this. And how do you then begin the cultural work? At what layer? And I think the question is, somebody actually asked, do we need to throw this away? And I think, societies are changing. I think there's space for it, but there's definitely the layered work that needs to happen. And at what layer, I guess, is sortition? Is at the very top layer? And what are all the other layers in between that you need to strengthen and build, whether it's trust between communities, whether it's getting people to see themselves in the idea of a nationhood and identity that is greater than just your tribe, and how do you work that? And I think all those are layers that then leads to some of these greater discourses, whereas I think in certain countries, like maybe in the global north, this is already something that you can, proceed to. This is a discussion that you can have. But, when you're doing this work, maybe it's different, like in different countries. Is this, something that you're aspiring towards? And it definitely raises ideas for discussion, because I was just hearing that and I thought, in decisions, we have occasions when we have, not really a citizens assembly, but decisions that people have to make. And the idea is always people carry their community fast. We actually nominate people to decision-making bodies to represent their community to begin, and we actually appoint people to boards to represent their community to ensure that they're not marginalized. And so that has been institutionalized. So is Sortition really going to change it? Or do you go there and you're representing the same idea that, your community wants you to carry, rather than the idea of this common good and just what is good for the society and the community? So. Yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm going to put a final question to the panelists, and then we're going to move to group Q&A. I'd ask folks that have questions in the Q&A chat box, there's a lot of them. If you'd like to come online or come on video to come share these, please just type something under your chat so that our team can flag that. Thank you. So for the panelists to close, I'd be curious, in terms of making this vision real, I think folks have poked at it in different ways. The Art's the coolest kid at school now, so I'd be really curious for his secrets. We know that power doesn't like to give up power. I'm currently based in the US, where more than those of half in Congress are millionaires. The median net worth of our Congress members is just over $1 million. New York Times investigation that came out, I think 2 days ago, found that nearly 1 in 5 members have traded stocks that involved a potential conflict of interest with issues that they are legislating. So all that to say, for the wealthy political class, the incentives are, of course, to hold on to this power. And naturally, this is certainly not just in the US itself. So I'd be curious just to get your respective reflections on that. What does it mean to make this vision a reality, given that the powerful like to hold on to power?
David, are you?
Well,
jump in? Yeah.
Men also clung to their power at the moment women were asking for the right to vote. And the reason that we finally got the right to vote was that people campaigned for it. And this is exactly the work that DemNext should be doing. This is going to take a lot of campaigning, and the model that is currently being used, that is perhaps serving the interests of these elites, will become damaging to these elites themselves. And so it is in their own interest to start opening the doors and windows of the policy making bodies. So I do believe we should take inspiration from earlier battles that try to democratize democracy. We have the right to vote. We claim the right to speak. And I think this is what we should do right now.
And maybe at a practical level, if I could just say that you have to start somewhere. Ireland was fortunate that the government led out on this, so it did have state support to get it up and running. But if there is a citizen-led movement that wants to do this, start somewhere. It might start local and then build, but you have to prove internally that the model works. That every community, every political system, whether it's local or national or federal, needs to see that, well, actually, this is a way of getting hard jobs done, and I think there's evidence of that beginning to grow in the United States now as well, where local initiatives of, well, listen, we've got 3 local towns here and we need to build a hospital in one of them. Where's it going to be? Put them all in a room and let them come up with a recommendation. I wouldn't recommend this, but the way it happened in Ireland, and it was more by accident rather than design, is that we had politicians involved in our first Citizens Assembly, the Constitutional Convention. It was 1/3 politicians and 2/3 citizens. So we didn't have to confront the difficulties that some had, like in British Columbia, where citizens did all the work and sent a report to the parliament or to the government, and they put it on a shelf because who are these people? What have they been doing, etc. When we sent our initial reports to parliament, the political system had been in the room. They recognized how we come up with the recommendations, where they came from. So it had already created a sense of ownership. So we didn't have to jump that particular hurdle. And so that made it easy for us. Every Citizens Assembly since has been citizens only. We've got a couple of local politicians on our Dublin local government one, but the point has been accepted now that the political system understands what goes on here, establish a citizens assembly to be independent, send us your thoughts. And if I could just come back to me in both the chat and the questions, and something that Brenda touched on as well, about funding. Citizens assemblies can be expensive to run, but they don't have to be. We ran our first one in the teeth of a financial crisis, where as a country, we were scrabbling around the back of the sofa looking for coins to spend to pay our teachers and our nurses and doctors and keep the lights on in the country. All of the money I had, I spent on the citizen experience. You know, it's just, well, listen, we didn't pay our citizens at the time, and it was, well, listen, we might as well give them an experience. We put them up in a nice hotel and we fed them, and we spent no money on anything else, you know. And as a public servant, this poses a challenge because it's easy just to throw money at every problem you come across, but it does allow you to reach inwards to yourself, to your inner well of creativity and innovation, etc. We learned a lot in that process about how to get things done without spending any money, and I'm very happy to share that experience with people, with anyone. You can contact me on social media, DM me on Twitter or something, but anybody that wants to know how you can run a citizens assembly for a $5, I'm your man.
Citizens assemblies for a $5. Thank you, Art.
Yeah.
Can I come in on that a little bit, actually? Because I mean, yes, I definitely share Art's view on this, but I think also we need to remember the bigger picture perspective and what are we comparing this to as well, because we spend a huge amount of money on the infrastructure around elections. And so if we put ourselves perhaps back momentarily in my vision of the future 10 years from now, where perhaps there still are elections for certain roles. I'm not saying elections completely go out the window, but where power lies is with sortition-based deliberative bodies, then I would say the notion of how much we're spending on elections today shifts towards supporting the infrastructure of deliberative democracy. I mean, I don't have all the figures for every country off the top of my head. I think the last Canadian election recently cost $500 million. If you think in the US about how much is spent on just the political campaigning that comes from private funds, it's in the billions. And so I think that this is also a bit of the mindset shift that we have to have, that first of all, yes, it does cost money to do these things, but at the same time, this is an investment in the basic infrastructure of how we govern ourselves. So I just wanted to put that slight framing back in there as well.
Thank
Noted. Yeah.
Now, I know we're coming up on time, and I know folks, are interested in, okay, so practically what this means. Where do we go from here? And I know the DemNext team has some ideas and invitations that you all would like to share. But I just wanted to actually bring up one conversation actually that's happening in the Q&A, which is Esteban is asking around, in order to actually work, deliberative mechanisms also need to deliberate with representative institutions and other intermediary institutions, media, organized social groups, and the like. Their point was that this was somewhat lacking in the Chilean recent referendum. So, there's sort of questions come out, how are we seeing that play out in Chile? And then Sean Roberts and a few folks then had a conversation around, what do people make of what's just happened in Chile? 80% of the population rejected the old constitution. The new one just got rejected by 62% of the folks. So I think there's sort of questions around how these mechanisms might interface with other mechanisms and models that we're seeing. And I know this group has a ton of expertise. So given it's a live debate, would love to put it to the group.
Maybe I pick on Helen. I mean, I'll also post a little link in the chat, but the two of us wrote a piece together that was published today about this. So if you want to explain a little bit.
Yes, so the Chilean failure, I don't like to call it a failure so much, because I think that not every democratic process has to end with a positive answer, right? So I think to me, it's a sign of maturity that they rejected a text that they didn't think was perhaps sufficiently good. So why wasn't it sufficiently good? Because the process was flawed, and the process was based on elections that brought to this Constituent Assembly a sample of 155 citizens that were not fully representative representative of the diversity of the country that were quite left compared to where the country is, that didn't include that many members of the popular classes, actually. And so the result is that they didn't quite track the rather traditionalist values of the country. And I think some of the articles scared people. And even if even if from the outside, this text had amazing progressive clauses on right to water, and rights of indigenous people, mitigation of climate change, obligations on government, stuff like that. There were, efforts to question the principle of the nation of Chile and sovereignty of Chile, as you know. So I think that went a little too far. And so the solution is not, as now, is being peddled by the right, to go back to an assembly of elected, officials or parliamentarians or party members, which is only going to further reduce the representativeness of the group, and will probably lead to a much more sort of a right-wing text that will also not make people happy. It's instead to go for a fully representative sample as possible. And I think the only way to get that, or not the only way, but the simplest, most efficient way is through random selection. And I think that's something that unfortunately hasn't been tried in Chile for this kind of processes, because again, their imagination, like ours most of the time, is really tied with this idea of election. And as long as we don't change that mythology around democracy, we don't change our understanding, it's going to continue making change difficult. But we tried with Claudia to put that out and hopefully influence in a small way the conversation there, because they've already had experience with deliberative polls and things like that. So I think it's kind of slowly taking root. There are seeds planted, but it hasn't really reached the political class.
Thank you, Helene. So I encourage folks to read that new piece that came out in Le Monde, I believe today. And with that, I want to apologize because we don't actually have enough time to answer all the many questions in here in the Q&A, but also I realize it's not really a chat anymore. It's not a bunch of people asking questions, it's folks organizing. Like the Q&A and the chat have been a space of organizing. And so that's really exciting to see. I hear sort of Slack. I know the DemNext team is going to be getting back to some of these questions in the newsletter. There's invitations to collaborate. There are invitations to meet up. Yes, to bus bays and poets, so there's all this activity and energy going on. And that is incredibly exciting to see. But I saw something from Doreen Grove, head of open government for the Scottish government, asking, okay, this is great. My question is, what do we do? What can we do as a bunch of people who are supportive to aid the work of Democracy Next? What does this mean? So DemNext team, take it away.
Thank you, Panthea. Maybe I'll come in on this and transition over to also being able to introduce all of us. And we definitely want to be answering this question of, what can you do? What can we do? Because we really see Democracy Next as something that, we're an organization, but we're also starting something that we definitely need a larger group of people to be working together to actually be making this change happen. And it's not going to happen just with the small group of people who are working behind the scenes, but all of us working together. And so, yeah, there were mentions about a Slack and other things. One of the things that we definitely want to do is set up some form of community. We're in the midst of doing a bit of a reflection of how could we set up some infrastructure around this to actually make the most of it. So that's why we haven't rushed into anything and so on. But if you're signed up to our newsletter, then, we will be communicating about this, about how you can get more involved with us as an organization directly, but the ways in which you would be able to connect more directly with one another as well. So that is definitely one thing. I'm going to share a little bit about, what else we're doing, and perhaps that will also spark some of the ideas more concretely about the different ways people might want to get involved. But I do want to hand the floor over to my amazing team, because also we've been working together to be getting DemNext off the ground, and I wanted them all to share a little bit about themselves and what what motivated them to want to be part of Democracy Next, and also to share a little bit of their own visions for what would be a dream project we would work on, which might also be something that if you're interested in trying to do one of these with us, we would love to hear from you. So I will start with Jeva Chesnotite, who is our founding head of research and learning. Jeva.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you, everyone. My name is Jeva Chesnotite, and I am, as Claudia mentioned, founding head of research and learning of Democracy Next. And I've been working on innovative citizen participation for now 7 years, first at the Lithuanian government, and then together with Claudia at the OECD, where we've analyzed the deliberative wave. And this is actually where I've discovered just how promising citizen deliberation can be. But since the beginning of the brutal war that was started in Ukraine, I've been feeling quite helpless because I'm coming from a first generation of Lithuanians that were born and brought up in an independent democratic Lithuania after years of Soviet oppression. And I really thought that all the horrors that my grandparents and parents have experienced were a thing of the past. However, this wasn't the case. But you know, feeling hopeless and helpless, but amongst the shock of and the fear that I've experienced together with the community back home, something beautiful and really unexpected happened in Lithuania, but also in Central and Eastern Europe more broadly. So along the efforts of their governments, everyday people were rising to the occasion to help the Ukrainian refugees and civilians and government to an extent that I could not have imagined before. Close to 70% of the Lithuanian population have actually contributed to the cause. Countless people, including my parents, opened the doors to refugees to live together with them. And so instead of giving into this fear, what I saw, it was solidarity and love that blossomed amongst this community. So to me, this gave immense hope, but also raised the question how this innate capacity that we have to collaborate, care for others, can be nurtured and employed more systematically, and then to help us address other shared problems that we have so many. Setting up Democracy Next is really about honoring our wonderful human qualities that we can offer to the world and proposing ways of governance that do so too. And my dream project for Democracy Next, thinking about the future, would be to figure out how citizens could be placed at the heart of rebuilding and collective healing efforts in the post-conflict situations, such as now happening in Ukraine. So, because having sacrificed their lives for their country, that's what people deserve, to be part of rebuilding it and at its center. So thank you very much. I'm so excited to work on this with this beautiful community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeva. And I'm glad that you are part of this community and part of these efforts and bringing in this perspective as well that you bring from Lithuania and all of these different questions that we're working on too. I will now pass over to John.
Will you? I'm next. Excellent.
You're next.
We
clearly agreed the order.
Oh yeah, oops. I've been running around and concentrating hard on the chat and trying to cross-pollinate a little bit. So it's been lovely to be in there with those of you who've been in there. We are going to save it, I will just say, and we will be sharing it. We are going to say we've captured the Q&A as well, and we're going to share some of that. Just to say a bit about me and maybe into the community point as well. So I'm really a kind of advisor and sort of on the edges of Democracy Next rather than a full-time member of core team. I have several full-time gigs essentially. I run an organisation, co-run an organisation called the New Citizenship Project, which is working with organisations of all shapes and sizes to involve people as citizens instead of just selling them stuff as consumers, and we're going to be partnering with Democracy Next on several things. So I think that's hopefully will be an experimental way to see how we can kind of all play together. Panthea is just very kindly doing my job in the chat and promoting my book as well. I wrote a book too. So yeah, that's pretty much me. I won't say too much more. It's I think maybe one last word. I think of this really as a soft launch. Like there's so much energy energy building in this moment in time, and for all that we've talked about, like that it's difficult and it's hard and it's a long way off, just in the last couple of weeks, folks, like the things that are going on in Switzerland, von der Leyen talking about this stuff, like the Biden finally calling out that there's a crisis of democracy, like this is moving really, really fast. And I'm just super excited to be in here with all of you guys, and it begins. Enough.
Yeah, thank you, John. It is beginning, and it definitely is just the start, the soft launch and the start of something here. Passing it over next to Mark.
Thanks, Claudia, and congratulations on the soft launch so far. It's just like like John and others. I'm merely an advisor to this group, and it's been incredible to watch Claudia and Eva and others pull this together over the last few months, and building on such an incredible foundation of all the work that's happened over the last couple of decades, especially. And so my background is, for the last 7 years, I was chief executive of My Society. And My Society, as many of you may know, I suppose has got a long history in sort of democratic participation and transparency work and so on. But it was when we get involved in the Parliamentary Climate Assembly that really opened my eyes to a different way of operating. And I've sort of reflected over the past 10 or 12 years of my career and how my work has sort of constantly gone back and forth between climate and democracy, and how, where I am now. I'm for the last couple of months, I've been executive director of the National Park City Foundation. So very different organisation, much more sort of grassroots, community-led organisation operating in the real world, rather than some of the sort of digital work we did with My Society. But it's the opportunity, the recognition that, and it's been touched upon a few times in the discussion so far, the recognition that the solution to the problems and the urgency for fixing the problems sort of has been going hand in hand. And we're getting to this point now where things really start to come together, where the answers are there for starting to address some of the most critical crises that faces as a society. And there's a real sort of urgency there to have these ideas applied, and those ideas that can get us towards sufficient consensus and sufficient scale to actually address the size of the challenges that we face with the climate crisis, ecological crisis, cost of living, and so on and so forth. So this has been an incredible honour to play a small part in this. I'm incredibly excited for where it's going to go next. So congratulations, guys.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for all your help in getting us going as well. And I mean, the perspective you raise, we didn't talk about it as much through this lens, but actually all the different crises, and the ecological and climate crisis being one of them, I really see as not really truly being able to address them without changing how we're taking the decisions about what do we do about this collectively. So this really comes back to the heart of how are we acting on everything together. I am conscious we're getting over time, but we are recording this, and so that's why I'm just allowing this to go on a little bit, and we will share with everyone who might need to leave us a bit before we end. I mean, we have heard already a bit from Helene as a panelist, but I do want to give her a chance to actually share also why she has been motivated to join and what the dream project she has in mind is as well.
So hi everyone, I'm Helene. I'm a political theorist at Yale University. I write books in democratic theory. So usually I'm on the very abstract, non-empirical side of things. But in democratic theory, it's impossible to stay completely, at the philosophical level. I've been pulled in the observation of actual experiments and completely convinced that that's the future, and that regular citizens, ordinary citizens are capable of so much more than what we're asking them under the current paradigm. And then joining this organization has been a no-brainer, because the minute I met Claudia, I was just won over by her energy, her talent, and I think we are, like all people on this call, we're very much aligned, and she knows how to make things happen. And so I'm just excited to follow her lead and see where that takes us.
Thank you, Helene. Well, that is the aim. We're not just putting the ideas out there. We actually want to be making them a reality. It's not just a utopia. It's not just a vision. I really think we can be working to do all of this. And last but not least, I do also want to introduce our newest colleague who is just joining us this month, Fiona. Please introduce yourself as well and share a bit about why you're working with us.
Hi everyone, thanks so much, Claudia. And interesting, super inspiring. I'm super glad to be on this journey with all of you. So my name is Fiona Santran, and well, I'm part of a generation that that can't afford to be homeowners, and I'm part of a generation that will live through the devastating effects of climate change and the mass extinction of the world's biodiversity. And I'm part of a generation that has access to so much information, like so much more than any other before it. And yeah, I'm also part of a generation where over half of my Belgian peers wouldn't show up to voting booths if voting wasn't compulsory. The promise is always that things will eventually get better, but the way that things are going, that just doesn't appear to be the case. And I think I'm part of a generation where a lot of my peers have lost hope that things can change for the better. And so to me, joining DemNext is that hope. The creation of DemNext is that hope. I think DemNext represents a more hopeful future, a better future, because its mission represents a world that I can root for, and a world in which my peers and I can really work together to change all of the horribly depressing things I've started my introduction with. So I arrived in the world of deliberative democracy because I was lucky enough to work in the Brussels Parliament on the implementation of their deliberative mixed committees. And deliberative democracy was just a revelation to me because it gave me a way to approach social issues that are important to me in a much more systemic and holistic manner. Like, how do we give people agency and actual power? How do you take all of their experiences and recognize that for just the gold mine of expertise and creativity that it is? And I think my experience of Brussels, I think it proves that, and with the 600 plus experiences throughout the world, we've proven this can work and that it exists, and so it's about scaling it up. And so I think, Claudia and Yeva have given me answers to all of these questions, and they've also given me a way to work on all of them and a vision of the future that I'm just really excited about, and for that I'm just forever grateful. So I just want to thank both of you so much, and thank you to the strategic advisors who all pioneered this new world, and to everyone here today, because I just can't wait to see where this journey is going to take us.
Thank you, Fiona, for the hope and excitement. That's definitely part of what we need. I'm conscious about the time that we've gotten to in this whole event, but I do not want to leave all of you without any sense of what are we actually doing at DemNext, and a bit of the sense of what we're up to. I know that some of you are also probably wondering, who's supporting us, who's funding us, and this is also something that we wanted to be transparent about. So we were really lucky and fortunate and grateful to be incubated with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation at their Bellagio Center, and we're really looking forward to continuing to collaborate with them. We're also very grateful for the support from the Open Society Foundations, and also for this from the National Endowment for Democracy, who have agreed a grant with us that we are just in the midst of finalizing, so it's not final yet, but we are in the midst of working with them on that. And we already have a few projects that are a little bit underway and in the pipeline. So we've been quite involved in President Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy. There's now an official cohort on deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies, which is sponsored in part thanks to Art O'Leary, because it's the Irish government and the European Commission that are the official country sponsors for this cohort. We're also leading two of the working groups as part of this. So Yeva has been very much involved with the work around Central and Eastern Europe, a bit what she was mentioning in her introduction earlier. And I'm also working on some thinking about how could we establish a global What Works Centre for deliberative democracy. Beyond this, we're also doing some work in different areas. So when it comes to democratizing government institutions, we have a collaboration with the European University Institute, which is also supported by the Berggruen Institute on EU citizens' assemblies, a permanent system for them, and we're also developing some propositions for a new system of city and urban planning decision making and how that could possibly work. We have a whole other program of work that's about also democratizing the governance of economic institutions. So this takes place with 3 pillars of work on work, investment, and money. So we're really excited to be collaborating with some of the people that I know have been here. So with Isabel Ferreras from the Democratizing Work Initiative, with Mike McCarthy from Marquette University, and with Juha Leppinen from Demos Helsinki. We're also doing some really exciting work around democratizing museums, which is in collaboration with Design and Democracy. It's a collective that is comprised of Vera Sacchetti and Amelie Klein. And we are working on finalizing some partnerships with a few institutions right now, both in terms of running some citizens panels with museums, but also on an exhibition around redesigning democracy. And then last but not least, we're also doing some work and thinking in partnership on developing some new measures for democracy. So this is something that John is leading a bit with more with his hat of the New Citizenship Project, but DemNext will be an official partner along with the Democracy and Culture Foundation around developing the Citizen Confidence Index. So a new way of trying to actually measure what do we mean by democracy that's more rooted in these ideas around agency, people feeling like they're actually able to shape and control their lives, have both the personal and the political efficacy around that. So those are kind of a bit of the things that we have underway. We also have plans, as I mentioned earlier, to actually set up some form of community. Again, we don't know what that will look like exactly yet, but do follow us to stay tuned about how you can get involved in that a bit more concretely. I've been really just amazed by all of the questions and everything and comments and ideas in the chat. So we will definitely share this, and we will also share some of the answers to the questions that were asked in a newsletter that will follow up in an email after this event is over. And I think before I kind of close, I also just wanted to really say a really, really heartfelt thank you to Panthea Lee for moderating this event, to all of our amazing speakers, Brenda, Art, David, Helen, to my DemocracyNext team that we're working with together, Yeva, Mark, John, Helen, and Fiona. It's really been such a team effort, and there's been so many other people involved in actually getting us to where we are today. I won't share all the steps of it, but there really have been around a few hundred of you who have given comments on certain documents, had conversations, have helped us in one way or another. So from the very beginning, DemNext has been not just about us, but really it's also about you. And we hope that we continue with this spirit as we continue to build this organization, build this movement, which we hope that this is really something that, these ideas the time feels like has come to them, and maybe they seem radical, but is it really that radical to imagine a future where everyone has equal political power? I don't think so. So I will finish off with a quote by the inspirational Audre Lorde, as she beautifully put it: "To refuse to participate in the shaping of our future is to give it up. Do not be led into passivity either by false security, they don't mean me, or by despair, there's nothing we can do. Each of us must find our work and do it." So thank you very much for joining us today. This is just the very beginning of a collective adventure. Please join us. We're really open to hearing from you, working with you, collaborating with you. Another democratic future is possible. DemocracyNext is all of us working to make it a reality. So thank you, everyone.